I'm not going to talk so much about, focus so much on Britain. I'm taking a more global look at food and how it was used in the Second World War as a weapon, and I'm taking it for granted that you'll be doing the more British aspect. So I want to start off by getting you to imagine what it's like to die of starvation. Which isn't a very jolly thought, I know, but there we are. It's known, you probably all know that as nutritional dystrophy. That's what you die of if you die of starvation. And so first of all, when you don't get enough food, your body uses up all your fat reserves. But then, once it's used up all its fat, in order to get enough energy, it starts breaking down the muscles. So you become very weak. And then also your small intestine gets atrophies and becomes much smaller, and it becomes much more difficult to absorb nutrients. Even if you can find some food, the food that you eat won't give you as much nutrition as it would have done if you were fit and healthy. And eventually your body has no alternative but to break down your vital organs. So victims of the siege in Leningrad, there were doctors still working in Leningrad, and they looked and examined the victims of starvation, and they found that hearts of people who died of starvation, which would normally have weighed 330 grams, I think that's with blood on death, were weighing about 90 grams. So people had used up the muscle of their hearts even. So that's quite shocking. You're overwhelmed by fatigue. A Leningrader described very well how the body is overcome by darkness, the deadly cold, the hunger, the lack of strength. And some victims of starvation develop something horrible called hunger edema, so you swell up with excess water. Others collapse and fall into comas as a lack of glucose, but most of them will die of organ failure, and that's the final cause of death. It's a slow and very excruciating process, and the National Socialists, the German Nazis, were very annoyed to find that it was a much slower and more inefficient way of disposing of unwanted groups of people than they'd expected. So people really didn't die that quickly. So it's really amazing, actually, during the Second World War, the number of people who carry on doing horrible physical labour and keep on surviving and just don't die of starvation. So the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were actually reduced to eating the ground-up rectums of cattle that people were smuggling in, and they managed to keep going on this. It's really quite incredible. So nevertheless, it's a rough estimate. It's very difficult to get accurate figures, and everybody disputes figures in the Second World War, but a rough estimate of the number of people who die of starvation during the Second World War, I would put it about 20 million. And that's equal to the estimated 19.5 million military deaths. So my point really is that the impact of war on food supplies is or was as deadly in its effect on the world population as military action during the Second World War. So many of those who died, we remember the 60,000 British people who died in bombing raids, but we don't remember the people who died of starvation. So about 15 million Chinese civilians died during the Second World War. We don't even really think about China as being part of the Second World War. 85% of them were peasants, and the great majority of them died of deprivation and starvation. 2 million Vietnamese peasants died in the Tonkin region. Due to the fact that the Japanese requisitioned too much rice from their villages. People in those villages remember the famine as being much more devastating than the Vietnam War, which we remember in the West. 60% of the 1.7 million Japanese soldiers who died in the war in combat probably died of starvation, malnutrition, and the associated diseases. I'll come to that later. And what about the Soviets then? Well, at least 1 million die in the siege of Leningrad, and we know that about 19 to 20 million civilians died overall. How many of those died of starvation? we don't know, but a very great many. I mean, I put in my book an estimate of 2 million, but I think it's too small. So an awful lot of people, and I could go on giving examples, die of starvation, and I won't even have begun to tell you about the people who die because they're afflicted by malnutrition, or not die, but to just have long-term consequences as a result of not getting enough to eat during the Second World War. So it's a terrible, lack of food is a terrible weapon during the war. Even for those who are not starving, so the British and the Germans, for example, are not in any way starving. For them, food, and for everybody else, food becomes an all-consuming preoccupation. So civilians spend their days queuing for rations, wondering how they're going to scrape together the next food to make the next meal. Digging for victory happens all over the world. So Irene Rush, who was an Australian school teacher who got stranded in Moscow during the war, she recalls in her very nice diary of the war, which is in Canberra National Library. It's a funny place to find stuff about the war in Russia. She remembers people every evening and every weekend. All the trains would be crowded on the way out of the city as there was an exodus of people with hoes and spades and things wrapped up in cloths so they wouldn't hurt anybody else on these crushed buses and trains, going out to do their gardening to help them survive. And another American who was married to a Russian theatre director who was also stranded in Russia remembered potatoes and how potatoes were known in Russia as the second bread, and people would cook nothing but potatoes, so boiled potatoes, fried potatoes. Irene, the school teacher, she recalled frying her potatoes in a kind of smelly green oil that they called American mechanics oil, machine oil. So I suspect it probably was machine oil. People would roast potatoes. They made potato cakes. They made potato soup. They made potato fritters. But as Margaret says, every effort to disguise the outer form left the soul of the potato unchanged. And you could see this when people paled on biting into the latest deception. So the quality of food, most certainly, even for those who could get it, declines horribly during the Second World War. The taste of war is billy or corned beef, mutton stew, rubbery powdered eggs, spam, gritty black bread, and potatoes, and endless potatoes. So if food becomes a civilian preoccupation, securing a food supply also becomes a central preoccupation for governments for all the countries who are drawn into the conflict. So growing, transporting, distributing food, it takes up precious resources. It takes up manpower, raw materials like phosphates and nitrogen, which make fertilizers, also make explosives. You need machinery, well, you also need guns and tanks, you need fuel, but you need those to fuel your war effort. So it's a lot of competition for for limited resources, but the human need for a fixed number of calories, and by now they are recognizing and calculating how many calories you need per day to do all kinds of physical work, mean that if your food supply fails, your army will fail, your war industries will fail, and eventually your civilians will fail and your morale will go downhill. So you've got to secure a sufficient food supply, and governments become very aware of this during the Second World War, and it's the fundamental basis of a wartime economy in the total war. So, among the National Socialists in Germany, the First World War had come to a terrible end with widespread starvation. Now, there's quite a bit of debate among historians about whether this really the lack of food in the First World War in Germany really is the cause of them losing the war, but that doesn't really matter to us, because the point is that Hitler and many of his associates believed that it was the hunger which had afflicted the Germans, which had brought the country to its knees. And you could say that a sort of food paranoia develops among the Nazis. Hitler finds all the details of agricultural reform and how you should, have food, better fodder silage and this, that and the other. He finds that profoundly boring. But it is something that many historians have made the mistake of assuming that because they're not apparently interested in these details, that the food supply is not of any real interest to Hitler and people like that. But that's just absolutely not true. There was a kind of incredible fear among the Germans and among Hitler and his people about what the consequences would be. So they want to spend their money on rearmament. They want to buy iron ore from Sweden. They don't want to buy cattle or butter from Denmark. But they don't want to alienate their workers, who are the basis of the rearmament program. So as soon as the National Socialists come into power from 1933, food prices rise, and it's a real problem. And Hitler, you find him in 1936 demanding that a brake is put on food price rises. He gives a speech in 1938 warning that food shortages could create a crisis for the regime. He's very worried. 38 and 39, he again gives secret speeches to the SS and people like that. And in these speeches he claims that the food question is the most urgent problem facing Germany. Now for the National Socialists, the solution to this problem with the food supply is Lebensraum. Now you'll all have heard of Lebensraum, space in the East. And Hitler's vision of what you should do with Eastern Europe is very much based on his kind of what he'd seen in America and what he'd read about what the Americans, the white Europeans, did to the Americans in the Midwest. So the Slavs, like the American Indians, are going to be driven out and exterminated and replaced by an industrious Aryan farmers, all producing endless fields of wheat to feed the nice Germans. So Lebensraum is going to solve the problem of Germany has a big need to import fodder to feed animals to produce enough meat. It's going to solve that problem. It's going to make Germany self-sufficient, immune to blockade, and it's going to give all the workers enough food to make Germany immune to the hegemony of Britain and America. And although German farming does withstand quite well all these problems that I talked about, lack of machinery and so on, labour, during the war, and does sort of more or less struggle through and produce enough food for people. From 1940 onwards, the regime has a series of food panics, and they pushes forward, the worries about food push forward a constant radicalisation of the Nazi regime. And food, in a way, becomes a motor that escalates the Nazi atrocities. So I can't tell you everything that they do, but Herbert Becker, he's my sort of little anti-hero that no one's really ever heard of. So Herbert Becker was the guy who was in charge of food under Goering for the 4-year plan, and he later pushes out Walter Darré and becomes the Minister for Food. Now he's your typical Schreibtischtäter, the guy who sits at his desk and apparently didn't do anything nasty, but actually comes up with appalling plans. So he comes up with a terrible thing called the hunger plan. And the idea is very simple. Basically, you take all the food from the fertile areas in Russia once you've invaded the Soviet Union and occupied and taken it over and victory has been achieved. You take the food from the Ukraine and you divert it all to the Wehrmacht in Russia and fighting elsewhere, and if there's any left over, you give it to German civilians, and you leave the Russians in the towns to die. And about 30 million Russians, they estimated, would die as a consequence of this plan. And you find a really charming chap called Franz Six, who is an SS officer. He describes it. So he says, in a strip of land which is pushed out as the Germans would invade, Russians would be decimated by hunger. All those who took part in this action would be forbidden on pain of death to give a Russian even a piece of bread, and the large cities of Leningrad and Moscow would be flattened. And he's quite excited by this prospect. So, the blockade of Leningrad, Kiev and Kharkov, where many thousands of people, millions of people die of starvation, these aren't incidental byproducts of the Second World War. They are part of a deliberate plan to starve people to death. And Becker believed that this hunger plan would be decisive in helping Germany to win the war. And it might well have done if they'd managed to implement it properly. And as panics over ration cuts, it never works very well because, of course, they don't actually succeed in occupying all of the Soviet Union. And so instead it's done piecemeal, and fears about food lead to little campaigns to kill what they call useless eaters, often Jews, and it speeds up an awful lot of the extermination campaigns against Jews in Poland and the Ukraine. So once the Germans had achieved victory in the Soviet Union, they intended to implement something called the General Plan for the East. All of the Eastern European population would be deported. You might have a few left over as slaves, and German farmers would move in, create an idyllic agrarian empire, and this would feed the Greater German Reich. And they calmly calculate at one point in 1943 that 70 million Slavs will die as a result. So, I think yesterday was the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. It's useful or kind of awing to remember that the 6 million deaths in the Holocaust was a drop in the ocean of what the Nazis actually planned. If you take the hunger plan and the general plan for the East together, they're coldly planning and predicting over 100 million people will die of mainly starvation as a result of their plans. The Holocaust was a tiny part of what they wanted to start. So that's quite dreadful to think about. So let's move on. In the East, the National Socialists wanted to withhold food as a means of extermination, but they also wanted to use it as a weapon of war against Britain, but not in order to exterminate the British. They just hoped to force them into surrendering. Didn't want to actually starve everyone to death. Now, Britain was an island dependent on global trade and imports for food. At that point, it's about 2/3 of the food coming into Britain in the 1930s is from abroad. And so it would, if Hitler had allowed the Naval Command to properly fund their U-boats and fight the war in the Atlantic as they wanted it to be fought, it would have become a deadly menace. As it was just a nuisance and a bit of a threat, but it never actually really brought Britain down to its knees, despite everything you'll hear about Churchill going on about the Battle of the Atlantic and everything. It never really was a threat to Britain's food. What happened was that food imports were cut in half, so from 22 million to 11 tonnes, but you had a big ploughing up campaign, turning pasture land over to wheat. And so by 1943, you'd gone from British farmers producing no wheat for bread to about half the grain needed to make bread for the British. But the British did still rely very strongly on food imports. They relied on imports to provide them with 56% of their calories. And all the talk about mock apricot tarts and everything, all very nice, but actually the really important thing was that the British Ministry of Foods prioritised importing condensed, high-calorie foods from America and the Empire. So West Africa steps up palm oil production and produces margarine. Canada shifts from grain to meat and produces bacon. New Zealand switches from butter to cheese, back to butter. Argentina provides endless corned beef. America, spam, sausage meat, frozen meat, dried egg, condensed milk. And the British government were not quite as paranoid as the Germans, but they had learned from industrial strikes and food shortages, as we saw during the First World War, that they really needed to pay attention to this. And so they had a system of rationing which was perceived to be fair And the food supply was probably one of the main core reasons why they managed to maintain morale among the British. So it was a pretty successful thing. The only problem was that they relied on the empire for food, but they didn't reciprocate by protecting their colonial subjects' food supply. So in 1942, the Allies attack North Africa with the Americans, and Churchill decides to prioritise bringing in food and supplies for the troops in North Africa. And then the second in line, he decides to prioritise civilians in Britain to make sure they're getting their corned beef and so on. And that means shipping, which is a real shortage of shipping at that point. It has to be cut somewhere, and it's cut in the Indian Ocean. It's cut by 60%. So that's a big amount in 1943. And the consequence of that is that in Bengal, which is suffering already from a man-made and war-made famine, 3 million Bengalis die of that famine. They never receive adequate relief. In East Africa, there are smaller scale famines. They're badly affected. And little islands like Mauritius are on their knees. They didn't die of starvation, but they're pretty much on their knees. So Mauritius produces sugar. We don't need to send ships to get sugar, so we don't really want to send ships to take them food. And so they make valiant attempts to grow manioc and peanuts and maize, and they scrape along, and they get a manioc starch from Madagascar, I think, and a bit of this, that and the other from Australia. They never, throughout the entire war, get a cargo of lentils. Now, most of the population rely on lentils for protein. They never get any lentils throughout the war. So most Mauritians end the war severely malnourished. Well, as we'll see, the British ended up healthier. So Britain doesn't set out with the explicit intent, like the Nazis, of exporting wartime hunger, but it certainly does succeed in doing this and exporting hunger to its empire. So when I began my research, I thought that what I would discover would be that food policies really did contribute hugely to whether a country won or lost the war. But I was surprised to find that in Europe this isn't really the case. So Germany and Britain's governments really feared hunger, and they feared that it would bring down their war effort. But it was the Soviets, of all the combatant nations, apart from the Japanese perhaps, the country with the least food and who suffered from the most desperate starvation, who did the most to defeat Germany. So most of the German army was concentrated on the Eastern Front. So you had 156 German divisions in the east. You only had 59 against the Allies in France and 27 by this point in Italy. So the Red Army is responsible for 80% of Germany's total battle casualties. It's the Russians who win the European war. And they're eating at least 500 calories, and that's on paper, less per day than a British or German civilian. Now, the communist elite, and that's a tiny few, stuffed themselves still on stewed meat and caviar, but there were Russians who would hang around outside factory canteens and lick the plates after everybody had finished their meal because they were so hungry. A dependent or a non-manual worker, so somebody who isn't officially part of the war effort, gets a ration of about 200 to 400 grams of very substandard bread, and the rest of the rations that they're entitled to are kind of pretty much on paper. They don't really appear. Irene Rush again talks about how hungry she was, that a piece of dry bread tasted like manna from heaven, and she took to frying her food not only in American machine oil but also in Vaseline, and they would go round to chemist shops and see if they had any cough drops left over and eat those. They were desperate. The majority of Soviet civilians end the war really undernourished or certainly malnourished. They have gastritis, stomach ulcers, dysentery, diarrhea, vitamin deficiencies. Of all the European nations, they suffer from all those really bad malnourished associated diseases. For Soviets, the war is just grinding, drudgery, nagging hunger. Collectivisation, which Stalin had introduced in the 1930s, does serve the government extremely well. So in the First World War, the Russians had the problem that they have about lots of landlords and small peasants, and they're all trying to get the food, collect the food in from these people, and they don't really want to give the food because then they'll be hungry and the cities starve. With collectivisation, you have 200,000 collective farms, you have a nice efficient system for collecting the food, and that means that virtually every scrap of food that these farms produce is taken away and sent to the cities. The peasants survive on potatoes, which they grow in their private plots, and famine foods, acorns, wild grasses that they collect. They don't get any of the wheat that they grow for the cities. And the Soviet Union loses to the Germans a vast swathe of its fertile land, so they've hardly got anywhere to grow their food. 92% of the workforce is women. Women are having to yoke themselves to the plough in order to plough up the fields, and almost all the grain, 3/4 of the grain that they sow, is all sown and harvested by hand. There's a chap describes walking through the fields in the winter, the first winter of the war, and the snow on all the wheat which hasn't been harvested because there just isn't the manpower to harvest the food that has been grown. It's really, really shocking in the Soviet Union. And life wasn't much better in the factories. You got some sticky, adulterated bread, you got a bit of cabbage soup, and you had to work at deafening machines for hour after hour in horrible conditions. Workers on assembly lines, actually, people record watching them keel over and die from starvation while they're actually working on assembly lines. There aren't any accurate figures for how many die of starvation in the Soviet Union. But what's extraordinary is that this breakdown of ordinary civilian life, the appalling food situation, never means that there aren't enough soldiers to fight on the front line or workers to struggle on the industrial assembly line. No collapse of morale happens. So what is it that keeps them going? People seem to have been inured to shortages already by the 1930s. There is a sincere belief in collectivism and a political conviction that communism can bring about a better future among some people. And certainly because the repression lifts a little during the war, people dare to hope that maybe after the war things will improve. So there's something to fight for there. There's fear. There's a terrible fear of the very repressive government and the awful punishments that would be inflicted on you if you don't turn up for work. But there's also an even greater fear of the enemy. They know what the Germans are doing in the occupied territories. They know that people are being killed wantonly, and it generates an enormous desire to fight savagely. American Lend-Lease, coming in 1943, really helps the army and takes some of the pressure off feeding the civilians. And because the drought that hits in 1946-47 only comes then after the war, I think that's why the Soviets, despite terrible hunger and malnutrition, struggle on and actually manage to win the war in Europe. So I've concluded that food doesn't really win a total war. It's slightly different in the Pacific. There, food plays a more important role in defeat or victory. So America is the only country in the world that experiences an agricultural as well as an industrial boom. No loss of land. They have pre-war investment in agricultural research, which they then employ. They have enough fertilizer, more or less. They have sufficient resources to keep on putting machinery into farms. In fact, all the tractors that are brought into British farms come from America, and prices go up. And so there's an incentive for farmers who've been in the Depression. it pulls them out of depression. There's an incentive for them to produce food. So the Americans are able with ease to feed 11.5 million servicemen and all their civilians, and the Russians and the British, and to some extent the Chinese. They're undoubtedly the best fed people in the world. And in fact, generous meals are one of the strategies that George Marshall employs. So you've got a set of guys in the army who aren't particularly, no one in America is particularly keen on fighting this war. They've got a very civilian mentality. So what do? You give them good food. So American soldiers are plied with meat and milk and vegetables. And if you think about it, many of these guys who are drafted into the army had suffered from the depression, so they're quite scrawny and hungry. And guys in training quite often gained weight once they joined the army in the Second World War. And the Australians were particularly pissed off about this. So there's a guy called Stan Tutt, and he's on New Guinea. So the Australians and the Americans both have a base on New Guinea, and it's across the road. And the Australians can see what's going on, so they can see the American soldiers have proper beds, they have mosquito nets, they have a mosquito-proof recreation hut, they have mail, and with their mail come oranges. They can smell one day when they're loading a truck for some reason, the smell of bacon and eggs drifting over from the camp. They hadn't seen a fresh egg since coming to New Guinea. And to add insult to injury, these eggs had come from Australia. So Australia is turned into a food production factory for the American army. 95% of the food for the American army in 1943 comes from Australia and New Zealand. They produce tins of meat, frozen meat, vegetables, biscuits, processed milk, apart from blankets and all that kind of stuff. And there's another Australian sitting on a supply ship. He describes there are boxes of butter and apples down in the hold, and they're all destined for the GIs around the Pacific. They didn't, and what's even more annoying is the American soldiers hated Australian mutton and cabbage and beetroot, complained about it all the time. They wanted American-style pork and beans and tomatoes, but at least they got lots to eat. And we think of Australia, and certainly in Australia, if you go to the Australian War Memorial Museum, what you'll see is a celebration of Australia's contribution to the war effort in terms of men dying and military action. But actually, Australia, probably its most effective contribution to the war was to supply food. And they supplied more food for the Allies than any other, per head of population, than any other country. And the Pacific Islanders couldn't get over how much food the Americans were eating. And the Americans were very generous with their food as well. So Pacific Islanders' kids' teeth decayed during the Second World War. The amount of the caries, goes up horribly. The trouble is as well, the Americans destroy the garden pits on Pacific Islands to make way for airstrips and roads, and they leave the islanders dependent on stores coming in from abroad of rice and biscuits and flour, unhealthy processed foods. And what you get after this is the speeding up of the Pacific Islands, being drawn into this cycle of importing food and debt and dependency, and you also get it really speeds up the epidemic of obesity and heart disease and diabetes, which are really of epidemic proportions in the Pacific Islands. So that's a real downside to the Americans' generosity. But the point about the American abundance is that it contrasts incredibly with the frugality of their Japanese opponents in the Pacific. So a Japanese soldier was expected to fight on a very tiny ration. They didn't have field kitchens. Each soldier is given a ration of rice, which he has to cook for himself over a little stove, on a little stove over a little fire. He has miso powder, a bit of soy sauce, if he's lucky some pickled vegetables, a bit of tea, salt and sugar. That's it. And so this meant that the Japanese army had a really tiny service tail. So they had one soldier to one service person. the Americans had 1 soldier to 18 service personnel. They're not all dealing with food, but that shows you. So Japanese soldiers, when they came across the American emergency K rations, just couldn't get over the fact that they had, these are just for taking into battle. They had chewing gum and toilet paper in and soap. They got things like that once a month in something that they called comfort kits. The Japanese High Command also had a pretty cavalier attitude to supplying its soldiers with food, and it doesn't, because American attacks on Japanese shipping becomes increasingly successful, and the Japanese are absolutely dreadful at protecting their shipping lines. What you get is all these Japanese strung out through tiny little islands in the Pacific and no food coming in. And so what you get is, for every 4 tons of supplies that the Americans ship to their ground troops in the Pacific, the Japanese receive 2 pounds. So that's the scale of things, the difference. And the response of the Japanese is to place ever greater faith in Bushido, which is spirit. So when things get bad, rely on Bushido. So you have a very Monty Python-esque pep talk from a guy called Lieutenant General Mutaguchi, and this is actually in an attack on India, but it's the same thing. So continuing the task until all your ammunition is expended. If your hands are broken, fight with your feet. If your hands and feet are broken, use your teeth. If there is no breath left in your body, fight with your spirit. Lack of weapons, and he might well have added lack of food, is no excuse for defeat. So it really reminds me, there's that Monty Python film where they have a fight and he chops off his arms and legs and the guy's lying there and he says, come back and I'll bite your legs off or something. Do you remember? That's the kind of attitude they expected their soldiers to show. So the Japanese High Command respond to their problem of not being able to ship enough food to their soldiers by telling them to grow their own food. So on Rabaul in New Britain, which is a kind of semi-tropical, fairly steamy island where basically you need to grow yams and things like that in the ground, these soldiers find themselves living this weird military come agrarian existence, and they all have a little garden and they keep chickens, and they discover that you can grow edible snails, and they catch lizards and snakes, and they manage quite well on this diet, but they're the supply island. So the men on Bougainville and New Guinea who are relying on these men who are growing their own food to send them food, well, they just starve. It's a disaster. You can't fight on the front line and do a bit of farming in the afternoon. And see, these men on the front lines end up eating dried grasses and sack, which is a kind of horrible, starchy, sappy stuff which you get out of sago palm. And that's what they send up to them to eat at the front line. So one Japanese soldier is actually picking leaves to eat for his dinner when he discovers on the back side of the leaf that he's about to eat chewing gum that a GI has discarded, and he thinks to himself, here we are holding on for dear life and these characters are chewing gum while they fight. It's somewhat undignified. Many Japanese soldiers resort to cannibalism. There are horrible stories about Japanese saying to each other, when I die you can eat me. When they capture American soldiers, they sometimes resorted to eating them. They kill all prisoners of war and they kill each other. It's truly ghastly. Of the 7,000 troops who are sent to New Guinea, about 9,000 survive. The majority who don't survive starve. They're not killed by the Americans so much. But the astonishing thing about the Japanese is their commander's faith in their spirit was not misplaced. They would usually choose to starve to death rather than surrender. And this is also the same story on the home island in Japan. So the government prefers to plan to fight to the death or starve rather than surrender. So long before August 1945, it's clear Japan's defeated. Bombardment has destroyed a large number of cities. The rail network has virtually collapsed. There are mines. In an operation known as Operation Starvation, the Americans have dropped mines all the way around the islands, so there's no inter-island rail or sea connection. Japanese industry has absolutely ground to a halt. Food imports from Manchuria and Korea, which the Japanese are dependent on to feed their urban areas, have virtually stopped. Even that food that comes through, there aren't any dock workers to actually unload the food, so it's rotting on the docks. The urban population haven't sunk yet into famine, but they're not far off, severe hunger. And the government starts distributing a horrible flour called, I've forgotten what it is, they give it some kind of horrible name, and it's called substitute flour. It's acorns, sweet potato vines, mulberry leaves. It tastes revolting, and it's actually potentially harmful. It can kill you. So, like in Germany in 1918, hunger had brought Japan to its knees, and yet the militarist faction of the government still maintained that they shouldn't surrender. So the Americans consider a slow and painful blockade where you actually starve them to death and all their prisoners. They calculate the number of casualties if there's an invasion, and given the suicidal fighting spirit the Japanese have shown on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they're issuing schoolboys with bamboo spears to fight the final fight against the Americans. Truman decides to drop the atom bombs, and it's only after the second one is dropped that the Japanese at last surrender. I started off my book totally against the dropping of the atom bombs. I ended it feeling somewhat ambivalent. I don't know what I'd have decided to do if I'd been put in Truman's shoes, but I think it's a pretty terrible decision. The war in the Pacific is really summed up beautifully by Sergeant Hiroshi. He's stuck on a cave on the island of Palau, and he's looking down at the American camp below him. And he says, "I could imagine the Americans sleeping soundly inside their tents. And in the morning they'd rise leisurely, shave, eat a hearty breakfast, then come after us again as usual. That sea of shining electric lights was a powerful, silent commentary on their battle of abundance. I had an image of the island divided in half with heaven and hell lying next to each other, separated by only a few hundred meters." American abundance, including the wealth of their food resources, ensured their victory in the Pacific. It ensured the Japanese defeat. After the war, America was the only country with a booming agricultural sector and plenty of food, and this continued their dominance in the post-war world. Thank you.
Thank you for an inspiring talk. It's interesting that you pointed out the cultural differences which have implications for the trends which set out the next few decades. I've actually got a question about water, because you talked about food as a weapon of war. How about water in general? Because you talked about drought, which affected the production of food. Have you seen in your kind of research any evidence of water pollution or any sorts of this practice to cut off water as a supply and eventually dehydration and all that as well?
Yeah, I haven't. Water isn't really a huge issue in that for this that I came up against. So I guess on Pacific Islands it could have turned into an issue, but the Americans could certainly get it in, and I think the Japanese certainly had means of collecting sufficient water, or they will have used the native islanders' means of collection water. So no, water doesn't really become a big issue, but certainly governments now worry hugely about water, and also during the war lots of people come up with kind of mad ideas that they could fly in and drop arsenic on crops and do nasty things like dropping napalm, as the Americans do during the Vietnamese crisis. And I know now that people have woken up to water, and there are all kinds of plans and counter, and you know, you can, there are, water is already a huge issue for Mexico and places like that. So no, I haven't, but you know, somebody might know better, but I didn't come across anything in the Second World War. Does anybody?
Any other comments or questions? I thought it was interesting that you mentioned in Europe that food policy didn't win the war. And you know, was that a surprise to you in your research, or were there any exceptions?
Well, I thought, yes, I was surprised that the Soviets, who were doing so badly and yet showed the most determination. But then if you think about what the Germans were doing to their occupied areas, then you can see why there's such a huge level of determination. And I think in a way the Germans and the British had learned their lesson from the First World War. I mean, you'll talk about this, but the British immediately implemented rationing, even before war is declared, and the Germans do similar things. So they had learned that you need to be organised. You can't just think, oh, it'll be all right. You can't have people striking. And the nature of war, they learned that the nature of war is much more reliant on marshalling your resources, marshalling your tanks, having sufficient war ammunition, and in order to produce all of that, you've got to have happy workers. And so the First World War taught them a lesson, I think. But I mean, the Germans were utterly paranoid about food and shortages. Yeah.
Thank you, Liz.
It's a pleasure, and I've got to unhook myself. I don't know how to turn it off, actually.